The morning of September 21, Est 1930, began the same way every other morning had at Cinnaminson, New Jersey. A man sat in a chair waiting to be shaved. He was 56 years old. His heart had been weakening for months, though he was not the kind of man who talked about such things. Outside the tomato fields he had cultivated for 3 decades stretched toward the flat horizon. Inside the house his wife had called ordinary and very ugly. There were no servants to speak of, no orchestra warming up in a marble ballroom, no guests filtering in from the main line. Just a chair, a bob, a man waiting. And then, without warning, John Thompson Dorrance suffered an embolism. For 4 days he lay in a coma. The fortune he had built, $120 million, at a moment when most of America was standing in bread lines, sat behind closed doors in Camden, New Jersey, tended by lawyers and executives who knew better than to disturb what they could not fix. On the morning of the 21st, the coma ended. The richest self-made man in the history of the American food industry was dead at 56 in a house he no longer really lived in a state he had been pretending to belong to for years, surrounded by a family he had rarely let close enough to know him. He left behind a 35-page will. He left behind 5 children. He left behind a fortune that would survive him by a century. And he left behind something that no notary could record, no executor could value, no judge could adjudicate. He left behind a pattern of men who built empires with their minds and dismantled themselves with a glass in their hand. A pattern that would move from father to son with the same quiet efficiency as stock certificates moving through a trust generation after generation, disguised beneath the best orchestras, the finest liquor, the most carefully maintained social surfaces that old money could buy. This is not a story about condensed soup. This is a story about what power costs and who, in the Dorrance family, kept paying the bill long after the invoice should have been settled. If you've never heard the name Dorrance before, you're not alone. They spent a century making sure you wouldn't. Drop a comment below. What do you think it feels like to inherit $1 billion and a family secret in the same envelope? In October of 1897, a 24-year-old chemist arrived at a canning factory in Camden, New Jersey, and asked for a job. He was overqualified by any reasonable measure. He held a bachelor's degree from MIT and a doctorate in organic chemistry from the University of Gilded. Columbia, Cornell, Bryn Mawr, and Gilded itself had each offered him a position on their faculty. He declined all 4. He wanted the factory. His name was John Thompson Dorrance, and he arrived at a salary of $50 per week with a single condition that he be allowed to equip his own laboratory at his own expense. His uncle Arthur, who ran the operation, was skeptical. Too much, the scholar, he thought. Not the sort of man who would find purpose packing tomatoes for a living. Arthur was right about the tomatoes. He was wrong about everything else. What Dorrance had observed in the restaurants of Paris while completing his doctorate was simple Europeans ate soup Americans almost never did. The reason, he concluded, was not cultural preference. It was practical. A 32-ounce can of prepared soup weighed several pounds and cost 30 cents. Too heavy, too expensive, too inconvenient for a country where convenience was becoming a religion. His solution was elegant in the way only the best scientific insights are. He would remove the water, cook the soup down to a concentrated form, have the can size, cut the price to 10 cents, and let the housewife add the water at home. The savings in production, freight, and storage were not incremental. They were transformative. Within 2 years, the first cans of Campbell's condensed soup were on shelves across New Jersey. Within 5 years, the factory was producing 16 million cans a year. And Dorrance was doing something else quietly in the background. He was buying the company, share by share, year by year, using every dollar the operation generated. He made offers to his uncle and to the other partners. The word within the company was plain: Dorrance had the recipes. He could walk out tomorrow and open a competing factory. If he did that, every share they held was worthless. Whether that threat was ever spoken aloud is not recorded. The result was not in dispute. In 1915, Dorrance purchased the last remaining shares held by the Campbell family, the family whose name sat on every label, and became sole proprietor of an enterprise now redefining the American kitchen. He was 42 years old. He had spent his adult life removing everything unnecessary water from soup partners, from a company sentiment, from a balance sheet. He was the most controlled man in any room he entered. He ran the factory from before dawn. He tended tomato patches in his own garden. He reviewed advertising copy, approved label designs, read freight manifests. Time magazine noted that many a banker's mouth had watered at the thought of bringing such an enterprise to market, and not one had ever managed to get a meeting. He had also somewhere in those years developed a serious drinking problem. The parties at Woodcrest, his 51-room mainline estate, were legendary along the Philadelphia social circuit. Friends described them with the reverence people reserve for things that happen slightly past midnight. The Dorrances always had the best orchestra, one family friend recalled years later. The best food, the best liquor. No one ever refused an invitation, and everyone would stay till 3 or 4 in the morning. The surface was immaculate. The interior was another matter. There is a particular kind of silence that grows inside a family when the man at the head of the table does not invite questions. John Thompson Dorrance, was a man of absolute sovereignty. He had engineered that sovereignty deliberately in the company structure, in his will, in the architecture of his tax arrangements, in the way he raised his only son. And if his nightly drinking was the mechanism by which he managed the psychic weight of that sovereignty, no one who worked for him, dined with him, or belonged to him was going to say so out loud. His son Jack grew up understanding this. Jack Dorrance was 11 years old when his father sat in that chair in Cinnamonson and did not get up. The man became in death what he had never quite been in life for his son. The hero of my life, Jack would tell an interviewer 50 years later, using the exact phrase, as if no more complicated formulation had ever presented itself. He was sent as a boy to the private Montgomery school in Winnerwood. He was marked wherever he went, as a friend later put it, as the heir, the only boy of the terribly rich Dorrance family. The kidnapping precautions began at Princeton, where he drove a car fitted with tear gas jets. They continued into middle age when, as chairman of Campbell Soup, he traveled a different route to the Camden office every single day, trailed by bodyguards. He enlisted in the Army in July of 1941 as a $21 a month private. He went to China. He rose to captain. He worked for a time with the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. He came home and reported without apparent complaint to the factory floor in Camden. His father had not intended for him to run the company. The will had made that clear, in the way that wills make things clear when the man writing them can no longer be questioned about his reason. Jack spent 14 years working through the ranks, floor foreman, assistant treasurer, aide to the president, before being named chairman of the board in 1962. He held the position for 22 years. He was by every account a guardian rather than a builder. One friend described it with the particular precision of someone who had watched the dynamic up close. Jack felt conscious that his father had made the money and he had not. He did not find great joy in being rich. He found it as embarrassing as it was fun. He also drank, not in the festive, performative way that filled Woodcrest with orchestras and overnight guests. Jack's drinking was quieter, and its consequences landed in places no orchestra could drown out. His first marriage, to a woman he had met at a servicemen's party in Joplin, Missouri during the war, ended in divorce in 1963. He told his children almost nothing about the company or the fortune that sat waiting for them. Jack told them nothing, his Texas quail hunting companion Belton Johnson would say later. Why bother 'em? By the mid-1980s, as Jack entered his 70s and began to disengage from the chairman's seat he had held for 2 decades, the consequences of that silence had become structural. A former Campbell director, speaking to the Philadelphia Inquirer not long after Jack's death, chose words with surgical precision. Here we have a chairman who is not communicating with the family shareholders and who is incapacitated much of the time. So the question became, who will actually run this company? The executives, the independent directors? We simply didn't know. The family cousins, 9 of them representing 3 branches of the Dorrance fortune, had grown up knowing almost nothing about the company their grandfather had built. They had scattered to Connecticut, New Jersey, Wyoming, Philadelphia's main line. Some had never met each other. They communicated when they communicated at all through Christmas cards and attendance at funerals. Their grandfather had removed water from soup. Their father had removed information from succession planning. Both men had left their heirs in possession of enormous assets and almost no preparation for what to do with them. In March of 1989, Jack Dorrance made one last attempt to hold the pieces together. He gathered his children, his nieces, his nephews at the Greenbrier Hotel in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, a sprawling resort in the Allegheny Mountains where the Federal Reserve kept a secret bunker beneath the ballroom floor designed to shelter Congress in the event of nuclear. An appropriate choice, perhaps, for a family meeting convened to prevent a different kind of catastrophic loss. They toured the Camden operations. They ate ribs and chicken on a veranda with company executives. They asked questions they should have been asking for decades. Jack watched from a distance. He slipped away from the party and into a black limousine and asked his companion Belton Johnson how he thought things were going. "Just great," Johnson said. "The only problem is the one we've talked about before. Can you keep this covey of birds together?" Jack looked off silently into the West Virginia dark. 12 days later, on April 9, 1989, he died of a heart attack at his home in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. He was 70 years old, the same age his father had never reached. What followed was a crisis that 3 generations of ironclad wills and carefully structured trusts had been specifically designed to prevent. Within months of Jack's death, 3 dissident families holding 17% of the company's stock filed papers with the Securities and Exchange Commission signaling their intent to sell. They hired Arthur Lyman, the Manhattan lawyer, who had interrogated Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearings, and sent him to Camden with a message: "Find a way to satisfy everyone, or we force a sale." On a ski trip in Vail, a family member mentioned casually to a neighbor that Campbell needed new executive leadership. The neighbor suggested the head of Quaker Oats. From that conversation, in the way that enormous consequences sometimes grow from the smallest social exchanges, emerged a secret merger plan. The project was codenamed Toad. It would have merged Campbell with Quaker Oats, moved headquarters to Chicago, and reduced the Dorrance family from majority owners to minority shareholders in a company that bore their grandfather's fingerprints on every label. Bennett Dorrance, the youngest of Jack's 3 children, the one living quietly in a suburb of Phoenix, the one no one had designated for anything in particular, got wind of it. He placed a conference call to the chairman and killed it. Project Toad was dead, but the fracture it revealed was not. The Dorrance family, which had held together through 2 world wars, a Great Depression, a landmark tax catastrophe, and the near-constant temptation of investment bankers offering 9-figure sums, was coming apart. Not because the company had failed, not because an outside enemy had arrived, because the man who had known too much and said too little, the man who had carried his father's silences forward, along with his drinking pattern, had died without a succession plan and left a vacuum that no will could fill. The chairman's chair, which John Thompson Dorrance had designed to be occupied by a custodian of family control, had produced exactly that. Custodian. A man who protected what his father had built by refusing to disturb it, including the parts that were slowly rotting beneath the surface. His strategy of silence, the Philadelphia Inquirer concluded, which had worked well for decades, was coming apart. The Dorrance family survived the crisis of 1989. Bennett made the phone calls. He held the coalition together through sheer unglamorous persistence, flying to Camden 4 times a year, sitting in conference rooms, talking cousins out of liquidating their shares, accepting the title of default leader with the resignation of a man who understood that the alternative was no leader at all. The company hired a new chief executive, an Australian named David Johnson, who had previously turned around Gerber products. Earnings improved. The dissidents quieted. The eldest of Jack's 3 children chose Ireland. John Thompson Dorrance, Ippy, as everyone called him, had spent 15 years as a cattle rancher in Wyoming, 18 acres near Devil's Tower, living on a $100 quarterly stipend from his father's trust and building a life that bore no visible connection to the Campbell name. Then his father died and his income jumped to $87 a day in dividends, and the estate tax code made its position clear upon his death. The federal government would take 55% of everything he had just inherited. His grandfather had maintained a fake address in New Jersey to avoid estate inheritance tax. It had cost the family $26 million. Ippy planted trees on 1,000 acres of Irish farmland and became a citizen of the Republic of Ireland, where the estate tax rate was. In 1995, he walked into the United States Embassy in Dublin and renounced his American citizenship. The following year, he sold his Campbell shares for $720 million. Congress held hearings. President Clinton proposed an exit tax aimed specifically at him. Representative Patricia Schroeder attacked him from the floor of the House. Ippy said nothing publicly and settled into a Georgian townhouse in Dublin. The instinct, protect the fortune at all costs, remove whatever is unnecessary, including apparently a nationality, was identical to his grandfather's. Only the scale had changed. Mary Alice, the middle child, stayed. She poured her inheritance into horses, Dutch warm-blood stallions imported from the Netherlands, an Olympic-level dressage program built on 238 acres in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and a competitive record that stretched across 87 Grand Prix victories in a lifetime. Achievement Award from the Royal Warmblood Studbook of the Netherlands. She sat on the Campbell board for 35 years and said almost nothing publicly about any of it. In June of 2025, she died peacefully at home at 75. Within weeks, her eldest daughter was appointed to fill her board seat. The seat passed the way a title passes in an old European house, not because it was owed, because someone had to hold it. There are now approximately 87 living descendants of John Thompson Dorrance. They are scattered across 3 countries. Some have never met. A few have never visited the headquarters in Camden. The family that once gathered at the Greenbrier in matching red and white bandanas now communicates when it communicates at all through lawyers and trust officers. The company itself dropped the word soup from its name in November of 2024. It is now simply the Campbell's Company, a $9.6 billion operation that owns Pepperidge Farm Goldfish Crackers V8 Prego and Pace Salsa, among others. The red and white can is still on the shelf. The gold medallion from the 1900 Paris Exposition is still pressed into the label. What the label does not record is the other thing that moved through the family alongside the stock certificates, the board seats, the trust. John Thompson Dorrance drank heavily and died at 56 of heart disease in a house he maintained as a legal fiction, having spent the last 5 years of his life building a deception that would cost his estate $26 million. His son Jack drank, and the drinking eventually incapacitated him, not dramatically, not in any way that produced a public record or a sensational headline, but gradually, quietly, in the way that damage accumulates in private, when there is no one inside the family with both the standing and the willingness to name it. The strategy of silence, which he had inherited along with everything else, made it possible to avoid the subject for decades. By the time it could no longer be avoided, Jack was dead. His son Ippy had spent 15 years on a ranch in Wyoming before the inheritance found him doing something very deliberate with the distance. John Thompson Dorrance made his fortune by understanding that water was unnecessary, that you could remove it from the product without losing anything essential. He was correct about soup. He may have been wrong about because what he removed from the Dorrance household was not water. It was the possibility of honestly reckoning with what the fortune cost the people who held it, the isolation, the performance, the years of playing prince and prisoner. At once the inheritance that arrived before the capacity to carry it had been built. The will said whole. It did not say anything about what to do with the weight. The can remains red on top, white on the bottom. The script is still cursive. The medallion is still there. And somewhere in Dublin, in a Georgian townhouse on a city block that cost less to maintain than the estate tax would have cost to pay the grandson of the chemist who started with $7.50 a week, and an idea about removing water sits with a fortune that the Internal Revenue Service was never allowed. Whether he considers that a victory is a question no one has ever been close enough to him to ask.